Welcome, everybody. We're excited that this is the first official interview with Rob Lalka, and because he's selling books for the first time. So, as you can see over here, but I'm very excited with my good friend to talk about his new book. And before we begin, we need to make a quick plug. Your son.
So Tice is 7, and he is now officially an entrepreneur.
Oh yeah.
My boy, I'm very proud of. He is an entrepreneur because he decided that he was going to start selling bookmarks. So this is a sign that he made for y'all to see. Bookmarks by Tice, and he makes custom bookmarks. Each one is unique. They have different prices depending on how much effort he put into it.
$100. Oh my God.
That was $1. The best part is that if he signs it on the back, it doubles the price, and so it's like it says signed by Tice, each of them that he's signed. So it's kind of like an NFT in some ways. But yeah, he was like, yeah, I had the idea because I was bringing in your book, and I realized that you would be able to sell bookmarks for me. And I was like, that's really nice of you, son, but like, who's got a better deal here, you or me? And he was like, oh, you do. You make more money off of the book. And I'm like, actually, not much more money.
Those are good margins.
Those are very great margins. That's right.
Well, we're going to have some bookmarks for sale after this. Well, before we begin, Rob, the first sentence of your book, call me ordinary. And I'd like to sort of challenge your book up front because I don't think you're ordinary. Rob is the professor of business at Tulane University. He's also the executive director of the LePage Center for Entrepreneurship Innovation. He has twice received the A.B. Freeman School's Excellence Intellectual Contribution Award, and now he's an author of a book. Rob moved to New Orleans, thank you, from D.C., on this walkabout, where you were the village capital, which actually was birthed out of New Orleans. You were a senior advisor at the Howard Buffett Foundation. You worked for the government, not knowing what you did there. We won't talk about that period of your life. You're on the current board of Public Democracy, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Venture for America. Went to a couple schools called Yale, Duke, and Harvard. But the most important thing is your son Tice is an Orleanian.
Yeah,
so welcome
right.
to New Orleans.
There you go. Yeah.
You make a main argument, and this is crushing to my soul, but that challenges the traditional view of tech entrepreneurs as benevolent innovators.
Yeah.
You argue that these individuals, while creating successful companies, sort of amass immense power at the expense of users and society. And you said, I'm going to shed some light, more light than heat, right? You want to show some evidence, but today we're going to put some heat on.
Okay.
But before I begin, why did you write this book? I mean, you are a professor of entrepreneurship. You teach, you believe in it, you're an advocate. Why did you do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll actually go back to that opening line. And so, call me ordinary. Ordinary's in quotes. And as y'all will see, I actually begin with the acknowledgments as opposed to burying them in the back like most people do. Usually acknowledgments are like the author's sort of personal privilege to say a few nice things about people who mattered. And for me, I wanted to put up front because I wanted to talk about my family, where I came from. And I'll begin by saying that the chance to go to these schools and be a part of my students' lives and to do the work that I do in the world, like it really is only possible in America, and frankly, only possible in America in the 20th and 21st century. Somebody who's from Roanoke, Virginia, born into single moms, who's a school teacher, public school teacher, just does not get those opportunities. You think about even a school like Yale. Yale was a finishing school for rich white people, white men, until the 60s and 70s, essentially. And so only in America, and only fairly recently, is this sort of a really amazing dream fulfilled possible. And so, I do think that in many ways, that was one of the reasons why the book needed to be written, was because we need to be able to protect that for my kids. And I'm worried about it because there's been such concentration of power and wealth. And a lot of that, to me, is it's not free market behavior. It's not fair, certainly. And I think that needs to be called out.
Well, you said, from the Silicon Age to the Machine Age, to the Bronze Age, to the Stone Age, entrepreneurs are worshipped as God, like heroes who were fulfilling their destinies. And you got a guy like Zuckerberg who started something called Face Smash, right? Just trying to meet women. And now he owns half of the island of Kauai. But they also, our information ecosystem is broken. So my first question, are entrepreneurs, they start out good? Are they good people? What happens to these folks? Are they bad and just do bad things? Or does something happen along this journey that gets them to some dire situations?
Yeah, I mean, where you began with that, let's start there. The internet is broken. The internet's broken. We've gone away from what we began with, which was that it should be meritocratic and free and about, it's a democratizing endeavor. Tim Berners-Lee, when he created the first website, decided to not patent the internet. The US government helped to fund it, and it was built in part because of Department of Defense funding. And then it worked through academia, and then it started to grow out from there. And it's broken, because what has happened is that these massive corporations, they're not startups anymore. Facebook, now Meta, Google, now Alphabet, these are not startups. We think of them as early stage companies, but that was 20 years ago. And to answer your question about what were they doing and why were they doing it, that's why I wrote the book. I go to the origin stories of each of these companies. And what I discovered is that it was actually way more complicated than I even understood as someone who is passionate about this and who teaches about this and who thought that he knew these stories. The origin story of Facebook was Mark Zuckerberg and a cyber attack. He hacked Harvard to steal the photos of college kids. These are the sort of deer in headlights photos that no one wants anyone to see, right? And he posted it on a website, and at the top of that website, code in Zuckerberg's own hands, it said, "Were we let in for our looks?" So were we let into Harvard for our looks? No. Will we be judged for them? Yes. Click to choose. And then 2 pictures appeared. And those pictures were of 2 college-age boys or girls. He compared boys to boys and girls to girls. These were choices he is making. He chose to take those photos without anyone's permission. He chose to post them. And he chose to then say, click to choose. And you know what happened is that thousands of Harvard kids did. They were clicking. It was sort of a ripoff of hotornot.com back in the day. But Hot or Not was you would rate people 0 to 10. Zuckerberg was literally doing a head-to-head contest of who was more attractive. And what is the sort of origin of that? Like, what does that teach us? Well, in chapter 1, I basically go through and I say, it taught him that judgment as entertainment was something that would addict us. Because the kids clicked on so many photos that night, it crashed the internet at his dorm room at Harvard. And what are we doing today? What is Instagram? It's judgment as entertainment. It's the same basic concept. And my argument in the book is that we not only should have seen what it was doing to our children, with the Surgeon General's warning that's in here in chapter 1 about how dangerous this is for our children. We not only should have seen it, we did see it. Like the college kids who were, in 2004, 2005, 2006 on campus, they are warning us about the things that we are now worried about. I went back and I read through the Harvard Crimson, the Yale Daily News, all these different newspapers. And we not only knew, they were calling it out in a way that was actually quite funny. They were making jokes about how ridiculous this was. They were saying this isn't the world that they want to live in, where you have to go online to be creepy to poke somebody. or to put on there that your relationship status is whatever I can get. I mean, that was literally what you see in that origin story. He was called out early, and frankly, those voices weren't listened to as much as they should have been. Now then we look at Google, the founding story of Google, and that one is chapter 2, and it's really fascinating because Sergey and Larry, when they started Google, built it as an anti-corporate endeavor. They called out Yahoo because Yahoo was running ads next to answers. And they said that this was the dark arts of corporate deception. Those words are literally pulled from their master's thesis at Stanford. And when you think about that, like, they literally were trying to bring the internet back towards academia, towards .edus, not .coms. They wanted to be able to make the internet about truth-telling, about trying to search for the absolute answer, right? And then, of course, they had to take on ads in order to be able to be profitable. And so that's the reason why Don't Be Evil. That's the reason why the Don't Be Evil slogan is that. It's because they couldn't possibly do good because they knew that they were taking money in exchange for answers, and they were presenting what a corporation wanted to show us rather than what was the close enough to the absolute truth that we could get from the organic information on the internet. And so if you actually go back to these foundational stories and revisit them, they're way more interesting than I even realized looking at this. But you have to look at the source material. You have to go back to the original source material. And that's what I did. I went back through the archives at Stanford, Harvard, these different places, and I tried to look at it afresh. And I think that I found some things.
So as you're teaching entrepreneurs and teaching the future entrepreneurs for this world, at what point did Zuckerberg and Sergey and others realize this was harmful? In the beginning, I could see this is a startup idea, we're going to play with it. At some point, there must have been a meeting or some research or something to say, this is bad, make a decision. When was that moral decision to no or go?
So here's one of the interesting things is that I make the argument that venture capital and the model of venture capital, it's not about profits. You have unprofitable growth for a long time with these companies. It's not about profits. This is not the business basics that we're used to, where you worry about your costs and you try and actually make a profit. What matters is growth. What matters is insane amounts of growth. And the internet allows you to do that. The technology allows you to grow at an exponential rate like has never been before possible. And I argue that has changed capitalism. That instead of focusing on building good, sound, profitable businesses, you're building growth machines where you care about what Mark Zuckerberg would say at the end of meetings when Facebook was just a very small company. World domination. That's what he would say. Domination. Domination. That was literally the mantra at Facebook. It was move fast and break things, and then he would end meetings by saying domination. And that is what happened. It became ubiquitous. It became something that we all use all the time. And that's extremely powerful, but it's also something that has then been able to monetize our time, monetize our attention in ways that we just don't even fully understand or reckon with. And so for Zuckerberg in particular, he made decisions and he made choices, and it was what his mentors taught him to do. Remember, he dropped out of Harvard in his sophomore year so that he could go with the venture capital that was backing him from Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman and others to build it this way. And what happens? Then what happens? Well, Harvard's motto, again, Tulane's is not for oneself but one's own, right? Harvard's is veritas, truth. And this isn't the truth. Like anytime you're posting something on Instagram, we all know that's not the absolute truth of who we are, what we are feeling in that moment. It's a dopamine hit, right? It's in some ways, a projection of the best version of ourselves. I might even say that's a deception. It's not the truth. But what did Harvard do? Well, they gave him an honorary degree, and they didn't just give him the degree that he didn't earn for dropping out of school. They gave him a PhD, their highest honor. And so when we think about, as society, who we celebrate, how we celebrate them, what are we celebrating there? Well, we're celebrating a technology that has become so incredibly powerful that we use it all the time, while the Surgeon General is literally saying that this is hurting our children, that this is changing the way that their amygdala works, the way that their brain is developing, the way that dopamine is fed to them. And what is Facebook doing at this time? Well, one of the other revelations in the book that is already starting to make waves is the fact that I went through Frances Hogan's files. So the Hogan files came out, and they basically showcased a number of ills at Facebook. But here's the interesting thing. The Wall Street Journal covered a lot of the Hogan files, and then they posted all of her slides online. I don't think anyone's covered this part, which is that Facebook literally had plans to build products for our children younger than 6 years old. They were literally planning to have children on devices during play dates, younger than 6 years old. And for me, like, that hits home in such a deep way. I mean, I was talking to Tice this morning about this very story, and he jokingly, he said seriously, which I took as a joke, but like, he goes, "Well, Dad, I'm 7 now. I don't need to go to playgrounds." Like, it was like a very like sweet moment.
I'm selling bookmarks, right?
Yeah, he's selling bookmarks. He's moved on, right? But I think about that. I'm like, is that really where we want to be as a society? Is to have our children on these things? And the statistics that I cite in the book are phenomenal. The number of children, the number of preteens, and then early teens that are on these platforms, whether we know it or not, it's astonishing and it's dangerous. And I think it needs to be called out.
So I'm still interested on the journey of these entrepreneurs as they start out, and then they find something, and then world dominance and scale. But there's another side of it, of the investors. Mm-hmm. And venture capital is a relatively new business that has burst onto the scene. But there's got to be a role and accountability for venture capital, or let me rephrase it, is there a role of the investors who are pushing this? So you have the entrepreneur who wants to do good, the investor says, yep, I need to show earnings. So tell me the role of the investment community, and for the entrepreneurs, be careful what you ask for. When you get money, what are you getting?
So this is my first public event, it's a sneak peek of this book, but last weekend I had the privilege of being able to be at the Berkshire annual meeting and signing this book at Epley Airfield. The busiest day at Omaha's airport is not Christmas or Thanksgiving, it's the Sunday after the annual meeting, because you have over 40,000 people going there. And for me, getting a chance to sort of hear from Warren Buffett about his approach, it wasn't just about business. It was about how do you lead a good life? How do you actually be decent in that? How do you find value that lasts multiple generations? And so I think it's important to realize there are ways of approaching business that are different than what I'm about to describe. Okay? There are ways of approaching business where you are trying to make sure that you're building sound businesses that take care of your employees, that grow responsibly, and frankly grow in a way that you can be really proud of. And I think too often venture capital, because you were trying to take this sort of growth at all costs mentality, leads to really bad behavior. And that's what I see in the book when you look at companies like Uber and the culture that they created, the way that especially women have been exploited, and the way that culture really became cancerous, is it needs to be called out and it needs to never happen again. And it came from the top. Travis Kalanick sent emails to his own employees when the company had already raised so much venture capital and was already a household name, where he was saying that he wished that he could have an orgy with his own employees. I mean, that is well documented. It was in Mike Isaac's book, Super Pumped. That's not leadership. It's really sad, actually. And that's something that I think needs to be discussed so that it doesn't happen again. Because, especially for me, teaching at Tulane, where that work hard and then play hard culture feels somewhat familiar from what Uber was versus Tulane. I mean, while I'm doing the research in this book, there's a study that comes out, Tim, at Tulane that says 41% of young women at Tulane, undergraduates, have been sexually assaulted during their 4 years there. That needs to not happen. And I think especially if you're looking at the way that in the business world, you can do it, you can approach it differently so that you're building a good company that actually has not this hyper growth and frankly tech bro culture hurting people, but really more like Warren Buffett, who actually cares about building a company culture that matters to building somewhere that people feel safe and people feel actually supported. You have choices there. And I think that's the main message for me through the book, is that we all have choices, and choices about which companies we support, which ones we don't. As you'll read in the book, it's not just Kalanick. One of the things that the book makes very clear is that the largest investor in Uber is the Saudi Public Investment Fund. Okay? The Saudi Public Investment Fund. So before the Live Gulf merger that got everyone all upset, the Saudis invested in Uber in 2017, $3.5 billion they put into Uber. And that was literally at the time when the Saudis didn't allow women to drive. And the company account was tweeting things like, "It's so great to have Uber everywhere," hashtag Uber everywhere, and that 80% of their riders in Saudi were women. That's because they didn't allow people to drive, folks. A basic human right. And when you think about that, it should cause a lot of moral conflict over what this has led to. But people aren't talking about the fact that the Saudis do own so much of Uber still today. We don't think about that when we order an Uber. And we also don't think about, and it's worth calling out, the person who struck that deal was David Plouffe, Obama's campaign manager, and someone who people would look at as being someone who cared about human rights and these other issues until he went to Uber and was the one who struck that deal. And so I think it's just really important to just look at the facts. And so there will be things in this book that are controversial. You can hear it, right? But it's because it's important. We need to shed light on what has happened so that it doesn't keep happening, because it's dangerous. It's really dangerous.
So within the accountability structure, you certainly have the entrepreneur, you have the investors and the board. Mm-hmm. Who's accountable in your mind? And maybe there's others, but those three are probably the power players. But a board doing their fiduciary work, is it to drive profits or do good? I know that's a challenge. So help me think through, or how do you think through, who is accountable here?
All of them, and us too. That's my argument. That all of us have responsibilities here.
What does it say about capitalism?
That this is not the version of capitalism that I find acceptable. I think that capitalism is the best system known to mankind to create wonderful social change that can uplift all of us. And this version of capitalism that focuses on hypergrowth, that literally will win at all costs, it's not even truly capitalism in my mind, because capitalism is about freedom. Capitalism is about a system where things are equal opportunity and fair. This is not that. And that's what worries me, is that especially when they start to change the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we even vote, the things that we see and how that impacts the way that we vote, they are moving into an area that I feel is very dangerous for us. So I'll give one example. Prop 22 in California. Uber had a ballot initiative that they and other sharing economies backed because the legislature in California tried to make it so that Uber had to pay drivers as employees. Uber didn't want to do that, so they created a third class of employees, and through Prop 22, there were 39% of California voters that were supporting it. 6 weeks later, after $203 million was spent, over $200 million, the most that's ever been spent on a ballot initiative in history. after $203 million was spent, that vote was changed. And part of the reason why was that every phone became a marketing device for them. So before you would log in to drive, you would get ads about this. Before you would ride, you would get ads. They're literally using these tools to change the way that people think about an issue. And people voted in favor of it, and it's fully documented. And not only did they do that, it was really deceptive. They were handing out ballots that had, for instance, in Democratic districts, all of the Democratic candidates listed, and the Democratic Party was against Prop 22, but the last line had them for it because they were trying to basically convince people that it was a part of a liberal agenda. The head of the NAACP was paid $85,000 by this organization to say that this was in favor of racial equity. Okay? And so these are old political tactics that are now applied in a profoundly new way with extremely influential technology that's changing things. The other example I would give is if you look at particularly Peter Thiel, he gave $1.25 million after the Access Hollywood tapes came out in support of Donald Trump. That was more than basically all of Silicon Valley combined. I document that. I go through looking up all of the different people who were supporting Donald Trump in 2016. The employees of Google gave more to Jill Stein than they gave to Donald Trump, okay? Peter Thiel gave $1.25 million in 2016 after Access Hollywood, so when everyone had counted Trump out, okay? In this last election cycle, Peter Thiel gave $17.5 million to J.D. Vance and $15 million to Blake Masters, okay? So just by the numbers, the amount that these people are involving themselves into our political process is going up exponentially. I think it's really important for us to consider an election year. Regardless of your politics, just knowing how the money is working in the system is really important for all of us as citizens. And those are the examples that I look at in the book. By the time you get to the third section, those are the examples we need to really pay attention to because they are organizing now. There was a dinner, according to Puck News, just last week, where Travis Kalanick, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, the same people who were mentioned in my book, all got together, and they are discussing whether they're going to back President Trump or not. And I think that that's just important for people to know. Now, what happens after that, I think that's important for all of us to decide, but these are facts that need to be known.
So there's always a lot of conversations about how do you measure successful entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial communities, and there's metrics of jobs and revenue, but exits and wealth creation. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts about how we should measure, value a successful entrepreneurial ecosystem?
And so, Tim, this is Tim's question of how do we make this less dark, Rob? Right? Here's where I go with that. I begin chapter 5, which is also a very dark chapter. So if you think this stuff's dark, Stanford literally allowed a professor to teach for almost 30 years about race betterment, about eugenics, and they've never admitted to it and never owned up to the fact that they paid students to do work study for him about eugenics. He was in the physics department, and his own genetics faculty, several genetics faculty said, this guy is basically teaching racist pseudoscience, and Stanford allowed it anyways. And they're going to have to reckon with that because it's now fully documented. It's the first time that anyone's done that. But that chapter, I actually begin by talking about the importance of entrepreneurship if you get it right. And I talk about Steve Case, who I know you are someone who he respects a lot because of how much you've done here in New Orleans. And I think about the rise of the rest. I think about the opportunity that comes when we do this right, where we have entrepreneurs that actually are trying to build great businesses and change the world, hopefully for the better, right? And what Steve often talks about is that all net new jobs are created by startups. Fortune 500 turns over. And these large companies will fire and they'll hire, they go back and forth. But startups are where jobs actually come from, because that's where you create new value, right? So I teach my students, if you want to change the world, build a business. If you're going to build a business, do it on purpose. Do it for a reason that matters to you. Do it for something that you actually believe is worth your time. And if you're doing that, I actually think that we can create so much value in this world. And people will pay for it. And that's how capitalism is supposed to work. That's where this works for real. I actually argue in the book that you can be pro-technology and pro-business, but not do this, not do the exploitative and dangerous win-at-all-cost mentality that ends up hurting people along the way. You just don't have to make those choices. And the good news for my students is that these large companies, if you don't like how they're behaving, well, guess what? They are the major conglomerates of our era now. These aren't startups, okay? So they'll be the ones you're going to turn over. They're going to be the ones that you're going to defeat. And that's what entrepreneurship is all about. Because if you look at this and say, you know what? If I was able to build an Uber that was better, that allowed people to, feel safer, or even better, allowed people to share in the value of the data that's created from that experience, that could change the world. Because I would love to have that alternative, right? Or you build a social media company that does the same, where people share in the value of all the content and the data they're creating. That could change the world. And I would love to have that alternative. I think many other people would. And so that's the opportunity that I see, is actually, not only can you create all net new jobs through that, you can also take the concentrated power that is, in my opinion, predictably corrupting, and you can disperse it and have it in a more decentralized way.
So in New Orleans, let's go down local to New Orleans, there's now an ecosystem in place with accelerators and incubators. Tulane is now deeply getting into the entrepreneurial community with the Innovation Institute and the Page Center and UNO and Loyola and Xavier. We have funds and all these. We have an ecosystem. What is, in your opinion, is the responsibility, or what would be a roadmap for the ecosystem to foster this responsibility?
So, I teach a class called the Student Venture Accelerator.
Okay.
And that's a 2-semester class where students come in and they build companies. And many folks who mentor in that class, Stacy and Evan, you guys come in all the time just to sort of support that journey. 2 things I'll say about that. One, I begin every year of this class not forming teams around ideas, because ideas are a dime a dozen. It's about execution. And if you already had the idea, you would have already done it, and you would have already made $1 billion before walking my class. Right? So it's not about the idea. It's about the execution, and it's about how do you work in teams to be able to build great companies. So instead, you could say, well, you should start around the teams. You should have people with complementary skills that come together to then be able to build a business to solve a problem. It's closer, but that still is not going to get you where I want my students to go, which is that entrepreneurship is not just about creating a company to make a lot of money. It is about who do you want to be, how do you want to show up in the world, and what legacy do you want to leave? Because that's more important to me than anything else, is 100 years from now, when people talk about you, are they going to talk about you like they talk about Warren Buffett? And that, for me, is what is possible in that classroom. And so how does that work? Well, we talk about values from day one. We say, what's the most important thing for you? And you make a list. And the students, I run them through this great values exercise. Well, on day one, we are sitting down there writing down their values. And the amazing thing about this is I've talked to fellow board members that I work with, or other people who are in their 60s and 70s, and they say, I've never done that, right? So I'm giving my students who are 21 years old a chance to actually think deeply about who they want to be in the world. And through that values exercise, we then pair them on teams of people who believe that the world needs to look a certain way, and they're going to work towards it. And I'll tell you, I think this builds better companies. Because if you're in it for the right reasons, because you're sharing values, you'll get through the tough times together because you're in it together for the right reasons. And so that'd be the first thing I would say, is that I actually think that that's what New Orleans does really well. We value the right things. We care about each other. We actually support each other. This is not a rat race where we're just trying to undercut each other. This is not a place where we actually think that, one of us is better than the other. We actually believe that we're better together in this. So I think New Orleans wins in that approach. And then 2, I always tell my students that you may think that there are 4 people on this team. There's actually a 5th, and the 5th is ChatGPT 4, because this incredibly powerful tool is going to help you to build your company. And I pay for their subscription for ChatGPT so they can use it to go fast, like as fast as they possibly can. But I also say, just in the same way that you wouldn't have a 5th team member that you make do all the work, you're not going to do the same with the AI. You're not going to ask the AI for the answers. You're going to treat it like a team member. And that team member gets smarter through the course of the year, because that's what happens with these large language models. And the students learn how to use it, not as a way to sort of look up answers, but actually to engage with it and do what they now call prompt engineering, ways of asking it great questions to get great answers back. And that, for me, means that I really do believe that the people who learn how to use this tool as entrepreneurs, and not just ChatGPT, but Claude with Anthropic and a number of these, will literally be able to solve problems in this generation that we thought we wouldn't get to solve for another 2 or 3 generations from now. I think that's possible. And let me add to that, these tech startups that we see as nimble AI companies are owned by big tech, okay? So ChatGPT, owned by Microsoft, right? Anthropic, owned by Amazon. I mean, you can go down the list, right? And so I think that it's important for us also to realize that as we have this great opportunity to unleash incredible creative energy and problem solving in an entrepreneurial way, we also have to recognize that there may come a time where these systems that are run by the larger tech companies reject the fact that they're going to be challenged by some of these smaller companies that are using these tools.
I think there's upwards of $110 million of this SSBDCI money coming into the community, whatever it may be.
Yep, 10 million. Yep.
So there's a responsibility of those who make those investments, because they're the ones who might determine what entrepreneurs scale and don't scale. So what's your message to the investors in the community? Because they're writing the checks and they're picking companies.
Yeah. I mean, the key for me is that investors are extremely powerful because there's a power dynamic where the entrepreneur is coming to you and you are the one who's making the decision on whether they are worthy or not, right? That asymmetry of power is very dangerous in some moments. You know this with Village Capital. The Village Capital model is that you would have peer-selected entrepreneurs, and the top 2 peer-selected would get an investment from the fund that we had raised, that Steve Case had invested in, Jim Sorensen, others had invested in. That was pre-commitment. They didn't get to choose who to invest in. And the reason why that model was so interesting and actually worked in especially one case, Empower Student Finance, that made the entire portfolio. The reason why that's so interesting is because entrepreneurs understand the problems they're trying to solve, and in a very deep and profound way are closer to the problems because they're experiencing them more than the investor likely is. And so for me, I still think that the Village Capital model is really profoundly important, but I want to take it not just through one incubator or accelerator program. I want to take it into the mindset of every person who's going to write that check, and thinking about how do I change the power dynamic here to truly be where I'm understanding the problem from the people who are experiencing the problem, the customer, and put the customer first. And so that's very much also one of the messages of the book, is that if you don't think that the people who have billions of dollars already have all the answers, then you need to take your voice, whether it's by voting, with your votes, or with your time, or with your attention, or with your dollars, or you need to go start something. You need to build it yourself. Because that's the story of America, is that quote-unquote ordinary people, right, can do extraordinary things. And oftentimes we never even know about them, right? We worship the sort of great man theory of history, of these people who history remembers, but even if you look back on history, which I do in the book, the people writing the history are the ones who had those accomplishments and had the money to fund the places that were remembering them. In the book, I use the phrase, it's a sort of collective selective memory. And that's not reality. Reality is that oftentimes people who've not gotten recognized for their greatness, people like my grandmother and grandfather who were part of the greatest generation that helped to destroy fascism, they were the ones that were actually doing the work. And so I think it's the same story for entrepreneurship in this next generation, is that venture capitalists need to be looking beyond their usual sources of deal flow and thinking about the problems and thinking about what we can solve, especially with AI.
So when millions of people read your book, what happens if the result is an anti-innovation movement? Or is there a fear of, or a recognition of, what if everybody says, you know what, you're right, we gotta get away from innovation and technology? What do you do about that, the anti-innovation movement, anti-tech?
Well, first of all, if millions of people have read my book and they come away with that conclusion, then we've literally had millions of people not read the ending. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be my answer,
Yeah.
is that the ending of the book, what I had the great fortune of doing is going back and interviewing the sort of background characters. So I'm gonna give it away for this group. One of the intrigues of the book is that you think the main characters are the people who are these tech titans. The main characters are actually these quote-unquote ordinary people you meet along the way, the background characters. And this is something it's an old literary trope. This is something that happens all the time when you're reading, especially great American literature. And so it's nothing unique that I'm doing with that, but it really works for this. Because the people who are critiquing Facebook in 2004, 2005, 2006, I go back and I interview them and say, you were right then in terms of what the Surgeon General is now saying about what it's doing to our children. What do you think now? Tell me, what would you do now? And they have the answers, folks. Like, we already have the answers. All of us do. Like, we already know that being able to start companies that give us an alternative to the current status quo, that's the answer, and that's more capitalistic. That's more free. That's more fair. It's all of the things that actually lead to a better fulfillment of, in my mind, the American dream. And so I think that's part of it too, is realizing that over 60% of people think that our kids are going to have it worse off than we do, and they're not wrong. They say that because they know that the system is not working for them anymore. It's the first generation in American history to believe that. You literally have people dying earlier for the first time in decades, while some of these tech billionaires are trying to live forever. That's literally what they're trying to pursue. That's what their vision of innovation is. And so I would say, actually, we just need to be able to grab onto that agency that we've always had and the answers we've always known, and we need to invest in them.
So I got one final question, then think about some questions if you have them. We're all ordinary people here. And I know it's probably at the end of the book you say this, but if you were to say one thing you want everybody to walk out of here with, that what ordinary people can do in order to change the roadmap for Tice and Katie Blair, what do you hope everyone does?
So I think that one of the interesting things about writing a book is that everyone asks you, who's it for, right? Is it for college professors like you. You write a book just for people like you. And I found it really hard to answer that question because I think that question, especially for a book that is deeply researched and has 1,902 citations, it could be intimidating, right? But my answer to that is I want anyone who's curious about any of these topics to pick this up because I try and tell the stories in the way that my grandmother used to tell stories to me, in a very accessible and hopefully beautiful way, in ways that are interesting and compelling, and that the more you think about them, the more you keep thinking about them, you know? Like, that's the way that I tried to write this book. And so my hope is that, I hope that at least thousands of people read this book, maybe even more, and that if they do, I don't give them easy answers at the end, but then the thought process of going through how do you reckon with this should help them to be able to make better decisions. I have a few things at the end that I propose that I think are, it's a little bit cute, but I say that if when you see an Instagram ad, instead of clicking on it, you scroll past it, and you can keep using Instagram. You scroll past it because you don't want to enrich them. If enough people did that in one quarterly earnings period, it would break Meta's business model. If you just scroll past it, you can still use the service. If you don't click on the ad and buy something, that would break their business model. So who knows, maybe that will catch fire, because then I hope for everyone in this room, when you see an Instagram ad, you're going to think of me saying this and be like, you know? I actually call that an act of civil disobedience against big tech. And I think that could be interesting. But who knows if that's something that catches fire or not. I mean, the main thing is I want people to read the book and enjoy the stories and then ask lots of questions. And I want this to start conversations.
Awesome. One is, give a real round of applause. And I'll tell you that, thank gosh I don't take Rob's class because he gave me all this reading material. Congratulations.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here.